My wife told me on a Sunday evening, the kind of Sunday evening that has no specific quality to it. Dinner finished, dishes done, the television on in the other room with nobody watching it. The specific ordinary texture of a life that has been lived in the same rooms for a long time. She sat across from me at the kitchen table. She said, "Robert, I need to tell you something." I said, "All right." She said, "Dennis has been back in contact for several months, and I think I have feelings for him that I need to explore." I looked at my wife. 23 years of marriage. The woman I had met when Lily was 3 years old, and Dennis had been gone for 2. The woman I had built a life with. Literally built, because I am an architect, and I designed the house we were sitting in, and spent 14 weekends helping the crew construct it, and there is not a wall in it I do not know from the inside. I said, "Dennis." She said, I know this is hard." I said, "Dennis, who left when Lily was 1. She said, "People change, Robert." I said, "Dennis, whose legal bills I paid in 2009 because he was about to lose his license, and Lily would have had to know why her biological father was in trouble, and I didn't want that for her." Karen's expression shifted. She said, "What?" I said, "I paid Dennis's legal fees, $14,000, through an intermediary. I asked him not to tell Lily. He agreed." She said, Robert, I didn't." I said, "I know you didn't know." I said it quietly. I said it the way I say most things, without performance, without the raised voice that the moment might have earned. I said, "Thank you for telling me." I got up from the table. I put my cup in the sink. I went to the study, and I sat with the specific stillness of a man who has just received information that reorganizes everything, and who is deciding, very carefully, what to do with it. My name is Robert Hale. I am 61 years old. I spent 37 years as an architect. I designed hospitals and schools and community centers, and one specific house, that I loved more than any of them. And the Sunday evening, my wife told me she was leaving me for the man I had once anonymously rescued, was the Sunday evening I began to understand what my life was actually for. Let me tell you about the house first, because the house is the center of this story. Not the marriage, not the betrayal, not Dennis or Karen or any of the things that people in this genre of story tend to place at the center. The house. I designed it in 2003. We had been married for 5 years. Lily was 8. We had been renting a house that was adequate in the way that rented houses are adequate. Functional, clean, without the specific quality of a place that has been thought about. I wanted to build us something that had been thought about. I spent 3 months on the design, not as a professional exercise, as something personal. The way a writer writes a letter rather than a document, with a different quality of attention. The house sat on a half-acre lot that we had found on a Sunday drive and bought impulsively, which is the only impulsive thing I have done in my adult life. It faced west, so that the main living spaces caught the afternoon light. The kitchen was at the back, overlooking a garden that did not yet exist, but that I could already see in the plans. The study, my study, had a window seat that I had designed specifically because Lily, at 8, had told me her favorite thing about books was that you could take them somewhere comfortable. The study had a window seat. I built it for an 8-year-old girl who liked to read. I hired a construction crew for the structural work, but I was there for 14 of the 22 weekends of the build. I hung the kitchen cabinets myself. I laid the tile in the hallway. I built the bookshelves in the study with timber that I had selected myself from a yard 40 minutes away. The house was finished in 2004. We moved in on a Saturday in April. Lily walked through every room and then came back to the study and climbed onto the window seat and sat there with a book and said, without looking up, "This is the best house." She was 9 years old. That was the best review I have ever received for anything I have built. I am telling you about the house because what happened 17 years later was not simply that my wife left me. What happened was that the woman I had built a home for, designed it, planned it, worked on it with my own hands for 14 weekends, told me she wanted to give it to someone else. And that is a specific thing. That is not the same as a marriage ending. That is something with a different weight. Now let me tell you about Dennis. Dennis Whitmore was Karen's first significant relationship. They had been together for 3 years. Lily was born when Karen was 26 and Dennis was 27. He left when Lily was 14 months old. He did not leave dramatically. He did not have another woman. He did not have a specific reason that he ever articulated clearly. He simply, in the way that some men simply do, stopped being present, first in spirit and then in body. By the time Lily was 18 months old, he was gone. Karen was 27, alone, with a 14-month-old daughter, and a very clear understanding of what she was going to require from life going forward. She was specific about it from the beginning. She told me, on our third date, that she was a package, and that anyone who was interested in the package needed to understand that the package had a child in it, and that the child came first, second, and third on any list of priorities, and that she was not interested in anyone who saw this as a complication. I said, "I'm not interested in anything you just described as a complication." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because a woman who puts her daughter first is the kind of woman I am interested in, and a little girl who needs someone consistent is the kind of person I am interested in being that for." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, that was 2000, 23 years ago. I want to tell you about Lily before I tell you what happened after the Sunday evening. Because Lily is the reason this story is not simply a story about betrayal. Lily Ann Whitmore, she kept her biological father's name because that is what children do, and because I never asked her to change it. Because a name is a name, and what matters is not what you are called but what you are. Is 26 years old. She has Karen's cheekbones and nobody's eyes. Her eyes are entirely her own, a specific shade of brown that is almost amber in certain light, that I have never seen replicated anywhere, that I noticed the first time I met her, when she was 3 years old, and she looked at me with the specific frank appraisal of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned to be anything other than direct. She looked at me, she said, "Are you my mum's friend?" I said, "I'm trying to be." She said, "Do you like dogs?" I said, "Very much." She said, "We don't have a dog." I said, "That's something we could potentially work on." She thought about this for a moment. Then she went back to what she had been doing. That was the beginning. She called me Robert for the first 2 years, then Dad for the next 21. The transition happened without announcement. One morning she said it, and I understood that it had been decided without either of us deciding it, the way the most important things are often decided. I coached her football team when she was 9, and 10, and 11. I helped her with maths, which was my weakest subject, which meant we were both learning. I drove her to auditions when she went through a theatre phase at 13 that lasted exactly 8 months before giving way to a photography phase that has lasted until now, because she is 26 and is a photographer and is very good at it. I walked her to her first day of secondary school. I was there the day she came home from university for the last time. I was the one she called at 2 in the morning from a petrol station when she was 19, and her first serious relationship had ended badly, and she needed someone to come and get her. I drove 45 minutes to a petrol station on a Tuesday night in February, and I brought her home, and I made tea, and I sat across the kitchen table from her, the kitchen table I had designed, in the house I had built, while she told me everything. She said, "At some point in that conversation, you're the only man in my life who has never let me down." I said, "That's a low bar." She said, "You'd be surprised how high it actually is." Dennis had come back into their lives, when Lily was 22. Not dramatically. He had sent Karen a message. This was what Karen told me at the time, asking after Lily. Karen had told Lily, because Karen is a direct person and felt Lily had the right to know. Lily had met Dennis twice over the following year. She told me about the first meeting. She said he was nervous and very eager to be liked, and he kept referring to things he remembered about me as a baby that I obviously have no memory of. It was strange, Dad. He was a stranger who was pretending we had history. I said, he is your biological father. That is a real thing, even with the rest of it. She said, I know. I don't hate him. He just feels like a stranger who wants credit for something he didn't do. I said, give it time. She said, that's very generous of you. I said, I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate. These things take time. What I did not tell her was that I had paid Dennis's legal fees in 2009. I had paid them because in 2009, Dennis had been caught in a professional misconduct situation, the details of which I am not going to share because they are his to carry, that had threatened his professional license and his freedom from debt that would have been significant and public. I had found out through a mutual connection. I had paid it, not for Dennis, for Lily, because Lily was 14 years old and did not need to know that her biological father was in the kind of trouble that 14-year-olds do not need to know their biological fathers are in. I paid it through an intermediary. I asked Dennis one thing. Do not tell Lily until she is old enough to hear it and to decide for herself what to do with the information. He agreed. As far as I knew, he had kept that agreement. What I did not know, until much later, was that he had told Karen, recently, and that the telling had changed something in Karen's understanding of who Dennis was. After the Sunday evening, I did not move out immediately. I have been asked why. I understand why the question is asked. The obvious response to what Karen told me is to leave, to pack, to find somewhere temporary, to begin the process of extraction. I am not an obvious response kind of man. I am an architect. Architects understand that the relationship between a structure and its foundations matters more than the structure itself, that you do not demolish a building without understanding what it is sitting on, that the most important work happens before the visible work begins. I spent 2 weeks doing the invisible work. I called my solicitor on Monday morning. I spoke to my financial advisor on Monday afternoon. I called my oldest friend, a man named David, who has known me for 40 years and who received the information with the specific calm of someone who saw this coming before I did and is wise enough not to say so. David said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need somewhere to stay that isn't here and isn't temporary." He said, "I have the cottage. It's empty until March." I said, "I'll take it." He said, "Robert." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." I also called Lily. She was in Edinburgh, where she had been working for 6 months on a photography commission. She called me every Sunday. She had called me every Sunday since she moved out at 22, which is a habit she began without being asked and has maintained without fail. I called her on Wednesday. She answered immediately. She always answers immediately. I said, "Lily, I need to tell you something." She said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Your mum and I are separating." Silence. Then, "Dad," I said, "it's her decision. I'm not going to go into the details because they're not mine to share." She said, "Is it Dennis?" I said, "What makes you say that?" She said, "Because I saw them. Last month when I was home. I came round without calling ahead, and they were having dinner, just the two of them, in our house. And Mum seemed..." She stopped. She seemed embarrassed. She said he had just come round to catch up. I believed her. I said, "Lily." She said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "You have nothing to be sorry for." She said, "I'm sorry for her. I'm sorry that she..." "Dad, you built that house." I said, "I know." She said, "You designed it. You helped build it. It's yours." I said, "It's in both our names. The process will take time." She said, "Dad, what are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to do what I always do when a project ends." She said, "What's that?" I said, "Start a new one. I want to tell you about the decision to sell the house, because it is the center of what happened next, and because it was not impulsive, and it was not petty, and it was not, as some people suggested later, a form of punishment. It was a considered decision made by a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why. The house was jointly owned. In the conversations that followed the Sunday evening, the careful, civil, professionally mediated conversations that ending a 23-year marriage produces, Karen had assumed, as I think most people in her position would assume, that the house would become hers. It was the family home. It was where she had lived for 19 years. It was, in her understanding, the natural center of whatever her life was going to look like going forward. Dennis, who had apparently been a more significant presence in her plans than the Sunday evening conversation had indicated, would move in. This was her assumption. She had not asked me about it directly. She had communicated it through the solicitor, in the language of financial settlement proposals, that suggested the house's value would be offset against other assets, and that Karen would remain in residence. I read the proposal. I read it carefully. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I called my solicitor, and I said, "We are selling the house." She said, "Robert, Karen's proposal." I said, "I am not interested in Karen's proposal as it relates to the house. The house is jointly owned. We are selling it. The proceeds will be divided per the settlement." She said, "Karen will contest this." I said, "Karen can contest it. The law is clear on joint ownership in dissolution proceedings. We sell." She said, "This will slow the process." I said, "Then it will be slower." She said, "Robert, is this about the house or is this about—" I said, "Helen, I designed that house. I spent 14 weekends helping build it. There is a window seat in the study that I designed for a 9-year-old girl who liked to read. There are bookshelves that I built from timber I selected myself. There are kitchen cabinets that I hung with my own hands." I said, "I am not leaving my house to become Dennis Whitmore's house." Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll file the response tomorrow." The sale took 4 months. Karen contested. Her solicitor filed objections. My solicitor answered them. The process was exactly as slow as Helen had predicted, and I had been prepared for. During those 4 months, I stayed at David's cottage. The cottage was small and quiet, and had a garden that needed work, and a view of hills that was excellent at any hour. I worked on the garden in the mornings. I drew in the afternoons, not professional drawings, personal ones, the kind I had made before I had a profession, when drawing was what I did with time, and not what I did for income. I was designing something, not a commission, something for myself. Karen called twice during those 4 months. I answered both times. The first call was practical, solicitor communications, process questions. I was helpful and clear, and ended the call when the practical matters were resolved. The second call was different. She said, "Robert, I need to tell you something." I said, "All right?" She said, "Dennis told me about the legal fees in 2009. I said, "Yes." She said, "You paid them." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because Lily didn't need to know. And if I had told you, you would have told Lily. Not from cruelty, from honesty. And Lily at 14 didn't need that particular truth." She said, "It changed how he sees you." I said, "I assumed it would." She said, "He told me because he wanted me to know what kind of man you were." I said, "That's interesting." She said, "It didn't work the way he intended." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean—" She stopped. I mean that learning you had paid his debts while never mentioning it, and never using it, and never asking for anything in return. It made me feel a specific way about the last several months that I am still processing. I said, "Take whatever time you need." She said, "Robert." I said, "Karen, I genuinely hope you find what you are looking for. I mean that without irony. I hope it is what you think it is. I hope Dennis is who you believe he has become." She said, "And if he's not?" I said, "Then I hope you find your way clearly from that as well." She said, "Are you angry?" I thought about that. I said, "I was." For about a week. And then I stopped, because anger is expensive, and the things I am spending my time on are better uses of the energy. She said, "What are you spending your time on?" I said, "Building something." She said, "What?" I said, "A house." The sale completed on a Thursday in November. I was not present at the completion. There was nothing for me to be present for. The solicitors handled it. The proceeds were divided and transferred. The keys were handed over through the formal process. I was in the cottage that Thursday. In the afternoon, I drove to the house. I sat outside in my car for about 20 minutes. I looked at the house I had designed, the west-facing facade, the windows I had specified, the front door, dark green, which had been Lily's suggestion at 8 years old, and which I had incorporated without telling her it had been her idea. I thought about 14 weekends. I thought about the window seat. I thought about a 9-year-old girl saying, "This is the best house." Then I started the car. I drove away. I did not look in the mirror. Karen and Dennis had planned a trip. This was something I knew from the solicitor communications. There had been discussions about timing, about when the house would be available, and the trip had been mentioned in context. A 2-week holiday. They were going in December. They went. I know what they returned to, because Lily told me. The house was sold to a family with 3 children who moved in 2 weeks before Karen and Dennis returned from their trip. The furniture, Karen's furniture, because I had taken nothing except my drawings, my tools, my books, and the window seat timber, which I had dismantled carefully the final weekend before completion, was in storage. The house had new curtains in the windows before they landed at the airport. A child's bicycle was in the front garden. I am told, Lily told me, that Karen sat in the rental car outside the house for a long time. I am told that Dennis said something. I am told that Karen did not respond. What happened after that belongs to them and is not mine to tell. What I can tell you is where I had gone. I had been designing it since the cottage, not quickly. Architects do not design quickly when the project matters. I spent 6 weeks on the early sketches, another month on the plans. 2 weeks refining, 1 week being certain. The plot was one I had found in the spring, a piece of land on the edge of a village 40 minutes from where I had grown up. Half an acre, a mature oak tree at the western boundary, a view of fields that would be there for as long as fields were there. I had bought it quietly. I had commissioned a local builder I had worked with on 3 previous projects. I had been specific about my involvement. I wanted to be on site. I wanted to do the things that an architect on a personal project does when he is building something for himself and has the time and the inclination. I had both. The build took 8 months. I was there for most of them. I want to describe the house because it matters. It was smaller than the family house. 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen with the same west-facing orientation I had given the family house, because afternoon light in a kitchen is a thing I believe in completely. A study with a window seat, designed differently from the one in the family house, designed for a 61-year-old man rather than a 9-year-old girl, but a window seat nonetheless. And one specific thing that the family house had not had: a dark room. A proper photographic darkroom, built to specification, with the right ventilation and the right lighting and the right workbench dimensions. For Lily, I built my daughter a darkroom in a house she had never asked to have, and might never use, because she was a photographer, and because the best thing I know how to do is build spaces for the people I love. She came to see the house in February. She drove down on a Saturday morning. She had flown back from Edinburgh the week before. Her commission was finished, and she was between projects, and she had called and said, "I want to see this house, Dad." I picked her up from the station. She was quiet in the car, the quiet of someone who is processing something that has been building for a while and has not yet found its shape. We drove to the house. I unlocked the front door. She walked through. She walked through every room in the specific way she had walked through the family house at 9 years old. Slowly, paying attention, taking it in. She came back to the study. She sat on the window seat. She did not have a book this time. She sat there and she looked out at the fields and the oak tree and the February light coming through the west window. She said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." She said, "You built a dark room." I said, "You're a photographer." She said, "I don't live here." I said, "You can visit." She said, "Dad." I said, "Lily." She said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "All right." She said, "I haven't spoken to Mum since the house was sold. I know she's called me several times. I haven't answered." I said, "She's your mother." She said, "I know." I said, "She made choices. She didn't stop being your mother." She said, "I know that too." She said, "But I need you to know something. Before anything else, before whatever conversations happen with Mum or Dennis or solicitors or anyone." I said, "What do you need me to know?" She looked at me. She said, "You are my father, not in the legal sense, not in the biological sense, in the sense that matters, in the sense that you drove 45 minutes to a petrol station at 2 in the morning to come and get me, in the sense that you built me a window seat when I was 8, in the sense that you paid a man's debts to protect me from knowing about them when I was 14. I said, "How do you know about the debts?" She said, "Dennis told me. Last month. He came to Edinburgh. He wanted—" She stopped. "He wanted credit, I think. He thought it would make me feel something toward him to know that you had done that." I said, "What did it make you feel?" She said, "It made me feel like I have always known exactly who my father is." The room was very quiet. Outside the February fields, the oak tree at the western boundary, the light that would be afternoon light in a few hours. I said, "Lily." She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm very glad you exist." She said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to answer Mum's call. When I'm ready." "Not yet." I said, "Take whatever time you need." She said, "And Dennis?" I said, "He doesn't need to be your enemy. He's a man who made choices a long time ago and has spent a long time managing the consequences. That's not nothing." She said, "You're being very generous." I said, "I'm being accurate." She said, "You always say that." I said, "It's always true." Karen called me in March. "Not through the solicitor. Directly," I answered. She said, "Robert?" I said, "Karen." She said, "Are you well?" I said, "I am." "You?" She said, It's been a complicated few months." I said, "I imagine." She said, "The house sold to a family." I said, "Yes." She said, "There was a bicycle in the garden." I said, "So I heard." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I owe you an explanation." I said, "You owe me nothing. We were married for 23 years. You told me what you felt. The process has been managed correctly. We are both free to make whatever choices we make." She said, "That's not what I mean." I said, "Then tell me what you mean." She said, "I mean, about Dennis. About why." I said, "Karen, you don't have to." She said, "I want to. Please." I said, "All right." She said, "Dennis came back into our lives and he was different from the man I remembered. Or he seemed different. He was attentive and present, and he had clearly worked on himself, and She stopped. I confused the work he had done on himself with something it was not. I said, "What did you confuse it with?" She said, "I confused it with proof that he would stay this time, that the person he had become was the person he was going to remain." I said, "And now?" She was quiet. She said, "He's gone, Robert." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "No, you're not." I said, "I'm sorry, it wasn't what you needed it to be." "I mean that genuinely," she said. "How? How are you this calm about all of it?" I said, "Because I am 61 years old, and I spent 23 years building things, and when a project ends, you learn from it, and you start the next one." She said, "I'm not a project." I said, "No. You're a person I loved for 23 years, and who made a choice that I respected enough not to fight. That is different from a project." She said, "Lily won't return my calls." I said, "She will. When she's ready. She's processing something. Give her time." She said, "What is she processing?" I said, "She's processing the specific difficulty of loving two people who have made it complicated to love them both simultaneously." She said, "Do you think she'll forgive me?" I said, "I think she loves you, and I think love finds its way to forgiveness when it is given enough time and enough honesty." She said, "And you?" I said, "There is nothing for me to forgive, Karen. You didn't do something to me. You did something for yourself. The confusion of those two things is where people get stuck." She said, "I hurt you." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you're not angry?" I said, "I was. And then I built a house." She said, "Is it beautiful?" I said, "It has a dark room." She said, "For Lily?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Of course it does." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Robert, I'm sorry." I said, "I know." I said, "Take care of yourself, Karen." She said, "You too." Lily called me on a Sunday in September. The Sunday calls had continued without interruption. Through the separation, through the sale, through Edinburgh and the new house, and all the complicated months of the previous year. She called every Sunday. She said, "Dad, I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "Jamie proposed." I said, "When?" She said, "Last night. We were at the restaurant where we had our first date, and he—" I could hear the smile in her voice, the specific sound of someone who is trying to sound composed and is not quite managing it. "He asked." I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said yes, obviously." I said, "I like Jamie very much." She said, "I know. He likes you very much." I said, "When?" She said, "Next June. We're thinking June." I said, "That's good timing. The garden will be—" She said, "Dad, can I tell you what the question is?" I said, "Sorry, yes." She said, "I want you to walk me down the aisle." I said nothing. She said, "I have spoken to Mum. We have been talking again, slowly, and it is getting better. I think it will be fine eventually. And I understand that Mum and Dennis are not—" She paused. "That's not what happened. Dennis is not part of her life anymore." I said, "I know." She said, "And I have met with Dennis. Twice. And he is a person I am choosing to have some relationship with. A small one. Because he is biologically my father, and because I think it is better for me to know who he is than to avoid that knowledge." I said, "That sounds right." She said, "But he is not my father, in the sense that matters." She said, "I want you to walk me down the aisle, if you want to." I sat in the study of my house, at the window seat, looking out at the fields and the oak tree at the western boundary. I thought about a 3-year-old girl asking me if I liked dogs. I thought about a 9-year-old girl on a different window seat saying, "This is the best house." I thought about a petrol station on a Tuesday night in February. I thought about 45 minutes of driving and a cup of tea at 2 in the morning, and a conversation I have never told anyone about because it belonged to her. I said, "Lily, She said, "Yes." I said, "There is nothing I would want more." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was doing the same thing her voice had done at the window seat in February, trying to hold something together that was finding its way to the edges, "You built me a darkroom." I said, "You're a photographer." She said, "I love you, Dad." I said, "I love you, Dad." I said, "I love you too." I said, "June is good. The garden will be ready." She laughed. It was her mother's laugh, the one that takes over the whole face. I want to leave you with something that is true. When you spend your life building things, you develop a specific understanding of the relationship between what is visible and what is not. A building that people see, the facade, the windows, the front door in dark green, is not the building. The building is what is underneath, the foundations, the structure, the specific decisions made before the first visible thing was placed. My marriage to Karen ended. That is true. What is also true is that the structure of 23 years was not the marriage. The structure was Lily. Lily at 3, asking if I liked dogs. Lily at 9, on a window seat. Lily at 26, in a new study, in a new house, looking at fields through a west-facing window. Lily in June, walking down an aisle. The structure holds. The building changes, but the structure holds. I want to say something to anyone who has been replaced. Not literally, not in the dramatic sense of a story, but in the quiet, ordinary sense of watching someone choose something else over the life you built together. You are not what they chose to leave. You are what you built while you were there. And what you built, if you built it honestly, if you built it with the right materials and the right attention and the right understanding of what it was for, does not disappear because someone else stopped valuing it. It stands. You built a window seat for a child who liked to read. She is sitting on it still. That is the whole of it. That is enough. I am 61 years old. I live in a house I designed for myself. It has a darkroom my daughter uses when she visits. She visits often. The oak tree at the western boundary is getting its spring leaves. The garden, which I have been working on since February, is beginning to look like what I planned it to look like. And on Sunday afternoons, my phone rings. It is always Lily. I always answer. I'll see you in the next one.